Welcome to this session on literary criticism, where we would look into feminism. Feminism is not a unitary concept, but an amalgam of diverse and complex ideas that address women's issues in society. Since there are various approaches to interrogate the issues of feminism, it should be read in its plurality, and the need to explore feminisms becomes imperative. The complexity, diversity, fragmentation, and contradictions underlying feminisms provide the initial move to comprehend feminism, feminist theory, feminist literary and cultural theory, and feminist criticism. Feminism recognizes that the inequalities that exist between men and women in the society is created by men through institutions of power like religion, family, education, knowledge systems, and all other social and cultural constructions that operate to enforce and perpetuate male domination. Feminist theory argues against stereotypical representation of women in society with few social, political, and financial rights. It is the philosophical and critical approach that utilizes the political position to interpret art or literature. Feminist cultural theory examines how the representation of women in diverse cultural media like literature, art, cinema, and advertisements are linked to the actual life and social conditions of women in contemporary society. Feminist criticism undertakes to reveal the underlying ideologies within texts that play a pivotal role in exposing as well as continuing women's suppression and oppression and the domination of women. Let's now look into the history of the feminist movement. The history of feminist movement is categorized on the paradigm of waves. To put it briefly, the first wave that evolved in the 19th and continued until the early 20th century aimed at securing women's right to vote. The second wave from the 1960s to the 1970s fought for equal legal and social rights. The third wave, beginning in the 1990s, is principally a continuation of and a reaction to second wave feminism. Let us analyze each wave of feminism in detail. We begin with first wave feminism. The first wave feminism emerged during the 19th century and extended up to the early 20th century in the United Kingdom and the United States. Initially, the movement concentrated on property rights for women. By the end of the 19th century, the movement focused primarily on gaining political power, principally for women's suffrage. The suffragists in Britain campaigned for women's rights to vote. The Representation of the People Act 1918 granted voting rights to women over the age of 30 who owned houses. In 1928, this act was extended to all women over 21. In the United States, the first wave of feminism officially began at the Seneca Falls Convention, Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848. Leaders of this movement included Lucretia Mott, Lucy Stone, Elizabeth Cary Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony, who individually campaigned for the abolition of slavery before defending women's right to vote. The men and women were gathered in support of equality between the sexes. American first wave feminism came to an end with the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1919, granting women the right to vote in all states. The English philosopher and advocate of women's rights, Mary Wollstonecraft, the French playwright and political activist, Olympia de Gouges, the French historian, Germaine de Stael, Margaret Fuller, the American journalist, editor, critic, who is a women's rights advocate associated with the American Transcendentalism movement, and Harriet Martineau, the British writer and political activist and one of the earliest Western sociologists, contributed immensely to the first wave movement. Let's look into some important writers and their works. Thoughts on the Education of Daughters in 1787, the first published work of Mary Wollstonecraft, is the collection of essays mainly based on her struggles and experiences in society. She also wrote a thinly veiled autobiographical novel, Mary, and Plant Original Stories, a collection of children's stories. She gave a derisive response to Edmund Burke's reflections on the revolution in France in 1790 in her A Vindication of the Rights of Men, in a letter to the Honorable Edmund Burke, also published in 1790. This was followed by A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, which argued for equal education and greater access for women to professional opportunities. A Vindication of the Rights of Woman is fundamentally a political statement. John Stuart Mill is a leading liberal philosopher of the 19th century who wrote on several issues related to social and political philosophy. He put forward a progressive theory advocating equality for women in society. His Subjection of Women, written in 1869, is a plea for equality and inclusion of women in social and political life. Ephra Behn was the first woman professional writer in English literature, with the performance of the play The Forced Marriage in 1670. She wrote 16 plays in all and challenged the conventional notions of femininity in her plays and in her life. Her reputation as a writer rests on the novel Orunoko in 1688, which critiqued the idea of the noble savage that was an early example of post-colonial reading. We move on to second wave feminism. The second wave feminism of the 1960s to 1980s focused on issues of equality and discrimination. The feminist activist and author Carol Hanisch coined the slogan, "The personal is political," which became associated with the second wave feminist movement. Second wave feminists recognized women's cultural and political inequalities to be the twin issues and encouraged women to understand aspects of their personal lives as intensely politicized that reflected sexist power structures. The start point of second wave feminism is the French existentialist philosopher and writer Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, published in 1949, a detailed analysis of women's oppression that provides the foundation for modern feminist thought. The Second Sex includes 2 volumes, Facts and Myths and Lived Experience. She followed Jean-Paul Sartre's precept, "Existence precedes essence." Hence, her quote, "One is not born a woman but becomes one," became her central precept. Her analysis focused on the social construction of woman as the other. Her metaphysical novels are She Came to Stay and The Mandarins. The American feminist writer and activist Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, criticized the idea that women could find fulfillment only through child rearing and homemaking. She denounced the false belief system that would require women to find identity and meaning in their lives through their husbands and children. Elaine Showalter laid the foundation for the promulgation of feminist theories that correlated with the American civil rights movement. Her doctoral thesis was expanded into her first book, A Literature of Their Own, British Women Novelists from Bronte to Lessing, published in 1977, where she formed a critical framework for analyzing literature by women. In the essay Toward a Feminist Poetics, published in 1979, she segregated feminist criticism into feminist critique and gynocriticism. Feminist critique is male-oriented and provides understanding of women's experiences from the male perspective. The woman is the reader of meaning of texts written by men. Marked by stereotypical depiction of women in literature, misconceptions and omissions about women in criticism, the male-dominated literary history construes what men think women should be. Gynocriticism, however, sees the woman to be the producer of textual meaning, with the history, themes, genres and structures of literature by women. The aim is to develop new models to study female experience from the perspective of the female rather than adopt male models and theories. It proposes to construct a female framework for the analysis of women's literature, to develop new models based on women's experience. The specificity of women's writing is seen to be the basic aspect of female reality. Gynocriticism focuses on the newly constructed visible world of male culture, values that destabilize the masculine systems that contain them. The African American feminist and theorist Gloria Jean Watkins, known as Bell Hooks, however, argued that this movement failed to incorporate race and class in their ambit and thus failed to address the issues that divided women. She pointed out the exclusion of minority voices in the women's movement in her book Feminist Theory from Margin to Center, published in 1984. The feminist writers Gloria Anzaldúa, Bell Hooks, Sheila Sandoval, Cherry Moraga, Audre Lorde, Maxine Hong Kingston and many other black feminists sought deliberations on race-related subjectivities within the gamut of feminist thought. Let's now elaborate third wave feminism. Third wave feminism was launched in the early 1990s in response to the perceived failures of the second wave feminism. Rebecca Walker, the daughter of the novelist Alice Walker, associated with second wave feminism, coined the term third wave and set up the Third Wave Foundation. Third wave feminism challenged the definitions of femininity that emerged from the second wave feminist movement. It argued that the second wave was parochial because it was concerned with the experiences of the upper middle class white women only. The third wave feminism included race, ethnicity, class, religion, gender and nationality to be significant factors when discussing feminism. It examined issues related to women's lives at the global level. Rebecca Walker, Jennifer Baumgardner and Amy Richards, the authors of Manifesta, Young Women, Feminism and the Future, published in the year 2000, are the prominent feminists. These writers' strategy to employ irony to fight patriarchy and narrate stories of survival to retaliate against violence on women is exemplary. The third wave redefined women and girls as assertive, powerful and in control of their sexuality. A post-structuralist interpretation of gender and sexuality is central to the third wave's ideology of feminism. With this, we move on to post-feminism. Susan Bullotin in 1982 published the article Voices of the Post-Feminist Generation in New York Times Magazine. This article expressed the views of women who agreed with the goals of feminism but did not claim to be feminists. The American feminist and author Susan Faludi in Backlash, the Undeclared War Against American Women, published in 1991, argued that many reports of problems plaguing women are constructed by the media without proper evidence. Therefore, this type of backlash is a historical trend, recurring when it appears that women have made sufficient gains in their fight to obtain equal rights. The American art theorist and critic and Professor Emilia Jones explicitly stated that the post-feminist texts which emerged in the 1980s and 1990s portrayed second-wave feminism as a monolithic entity and criticized it using generalizations. Other post-feminists proposed that feminism was no longer relevant to present society. The British cultural theorist, feminist and commentator Angela McRobbie argued that adding the prefix post to feminism emasculated the efforts of feminism from achieving equality for all, including women. Post-feminism gave the impression that equality had been achieved and that feminists could divert their attention to something else. With this, we move on to fourth wave feminism. Sexual harassment, inflicting body shame and rape culture are the foci of fourth wave feminism. The gang rape of a young girl in India in December 2012 sparked protests and international outrage. Donald Trump's provocative remarks against women initiated a march on January 21, 2017 in Washington, D.C., where women in America raised the clarion call for social change and gender equality. The Me Too movement began in 2006 in the United States to assist survivors of sexual violence and abuse. The movement exploded after the American film producer Harvey Weinstein was charged of sexual harassment of the female actors. From 2017 onwards, social media has been using the hashtag #MeToo against sexual harassment and condemnation of powerful men and the perpetrators of sexual abuse. Let's now look into certain aspects of French feminism. French feminism is associated with a group of feminists that includes Julia Kristeva, Hélène Cixous, Luce Irigaray and the French feminist film theorist Brecha Ettinger, who rose to prominence between 1970 and 1990. The French feminists, in contrast to their American counterparts, were more theoretical and philosophical in their outlook. They were more concerned with theories related to the body. In the 1970s, the concept of l'écriture féminine, translated as female or feminine writing, advanced by the French feminists, gained popularity. Hélène Cixous reiterates that writing and philosophy are phallocentric, while Luce Irigaray insisted that writing from the body is a subversive practice. Julia Kristeva made a psychoanalytic approach to post-structuralist criticism. She proposed that bodily drives are discharged in language whose structure operates in the body. All this being said, how could one forget the contribution of Virginia Woolf? Virginia Woolf wrote and published her works between 1920 and 1930. She dealt with her experiences and realities of sexism in matters of employment, in opportunities in higher education, right to enfranchisement, and freedom of creative expression. Naomi Black, in her book Virginia Woolf as a Feminist, points out, I quote, her feminism was original, yet firmly rooted in the women's movement of her time. She remains a pioneer along with 19th century feminist thinkers in expressing the politics and history of her age in her works, unquote. A Room of One's Own in 1929 and 3 Guineas in 1938 comprise important ideas that have influenced feminist writers and thinkers, especially since the 1960s. She finds inequality among women and men on every level of social, political, economic and literary fronts. Patriarchy and the masculine oppression of wives and daughters in public spheres of business, law, education and religion act as the driving principles behind imperialism and colonialism, see women as inferior and hence remain the primary causes of oppression of women. This imbalance of power and rule of patriarchy is visible in literature too. A Room of One's Own was based on Woolf's lectures delivered to women students at Cambridge. The main tenet of the treatise is that a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. Woolf invents the story of Judith Shakespeare, the imaginary sister of William Shakespeare, to account for the absence of a female figure in the English Renaissance. Judith was as gifted as her brother, but her creative abilities could not be realized due to her gender. Let's move on into feminism and feminist criticism. Peter Barry, in Beginning Theory, opines that the women's movement of the 1960s was a renewal of an old tradition of thought and action that discussed the problem of women's inequality in society. He identifies certain texts that were crucial in framing the agenda of feminism. They are Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, 1792, which discusses the male writers John Milton, Alexander Pope and Rousseau; Olive Schreiner's Women and Labour in 1911; Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, 1929, which portrays the unequal treatment given to women seeking education and alternatives to marriage and motherhood; Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex in 1949, which has an important section on the portrayal of women in the novels of D.H. Lawrence; John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Women, 1869, and The Origin of Family, 1884, by Frederick Engels. Let's look into feminist criticism, the development of feminist literary criticism in the 1960s. The feminist literary criticism is principally the outcome of the women's movement of the 1960s. It realized the significance of questioning the stereotypical images of women expressed by literature and considered combating them as important. The concern with conditioning and socialization requires a distinction between the terms feminist, female and feminine. Toral Moi, in the essay Feminist, female feminine explains, I quote, "Feminist is a political position, femaleness as a matter of biology, and femininity as a set of culturally defined characteristics," unquote. The representation of women in literature was considered to be one of the vital forms of socialization. The accepted versions of the feminine and legitimate feminine goals and aspirations were provided through feminine representations in literature. Feminists, however, examined the influence of the fiction of a particular century on the lives of women, where the socio-economic and political conditions of the period decided their social status. With this, we move on to analyzing feminist criticism in the 1970s. Feminist criticism in the 1970s exposed the workings of patriarchy that perpetuated sexual inequality. Critical attention was given to books by male writers that constructed stereotypical images of women. The criticism which undertook this task was polemical. In the 1980s, feminist criticism became much more eclectic, which means that it gave importance to the findings and approaches of other kinds of criticism such as Marxism, structuralism, post-structuralism and eco-criticism, to name a few. Feminist criticism retreated from attacking male versions of the world and explored the nature of the female world and outlook, and strived to reconstruct the lost or unexplored records of female experience. Feminist criticism underwent a sea change during the 1970s. The need to construct a new canon of women's writing by reviewing the history of the novel and poetry was considered important. The otherwise neglected women writers were given new prominence. The American literary critic, feminist and writer Elaine Showalter described the change in feminist criticism in the late 1970s as a shift in attention from andro text, which means books by men, to gyno texts, which means books by women. She coined the term gynocritics, meaning the study of gyno texts. The subject of gynocriticism is related to history, themes, genres and the psychodynamics of female creativity. That also includes female literary tradition. Showalter, in A Literature of Their Own, British women novelists from Bronte to Lessing, traces the history of women's writing to be categorized into three phases, namely the feminine phase, the feminist phase and the female phase. Let us now elaborate each phase. The first, the feminine phase, between 1840 and 1880. Women writers imitated dominant male artistic norms and aesthetic standards. The distinguishing characteristic of this period is the use of the male pseudonym. This trend prevailed in England from the 1840s among the English women writers. The second phase is the feminist phase between 1880 and 1920. During this period, the New Woman movement gained popularity. Women protested against male standards and norms, maintained a radical position and advocated women's rights and values. They used literature to project the ideals of wrong womanhood. The third phase is the female phase from 1920 onwards. This phase is characterized by the rejection of imitation and protest, which are considered to be the signs of dependency. Female experience is crucial to the development of art and literature. Hence, women writers must particularly address the autonomy of art because female writing and female experiences are individualistic and typical. Women writers began to concentrate on the forms and techniques of art and literature. Let us now analyze feminist criticism in relation to theory, language and psychoanalysis in brief. Several central concerns of feminist criticism related to the function of theory, the nature of language and the value of psychoanalysis were analyzed and studied since the 1970s. These fundamental issues raised pertinent questions about the influence of divergent feminist approaches on the feminist literary movement, the need for a separate language to account for feminine experiences and the effect of the relationship of psychology and feminism. English, American and French feminisms differed in the role of theory, language and psychoanalysis in the explication of feminist criticism. The Anglo-American version of feminism is more skeptical about modern critical theory than French feminism. The French feminists conduct post-structuralist and psychoanalytic analysis of their works. The Anglo-American critics take interest in analyzing themes, motives and characterization in works of art. They rely on close reading and explaining individual texts to practice feminist criticism, while British feminist criticism tends to be more socialist in function and aligned with cultural materialism or Marxism. American feminism is more political in nature. In contrast to British and American feminist criticisms, the French feminist critics are more theoretically oriented and their theory is based on Lacan, Foucault and Derrida. The French feminist critics do not consider the literary text to represent reality or express personal experience. The French theorists are more concerned with language, representation and psychology than textual analysis. The major French feminist critics are Julia Kristeva, Helen Sixou and Luce Irigaray. Regarding language, Virginia Woolf was the first to express the view that the use of language is gendered because when a woman decides to write a novel, she finds that there is no common sentence ready for use. This was her quote. The female writer is seen to suffer the handicap of not having a language of her own. Marxism has influenced feminism to the extent that the relationship between labor and capital is primarily centered on gender. Michelle Barrett, in her book Marxist Feminist Analysis in 1980, mentions that patriarchy, reproduction and ideology are the three factors on which Marxist feminist approach is grounded. Elaine Showalter coined the term gynocritics, which means the study of writing by women. The French theorists advocate feminine, which means women's writing. The inscription of the female body and female difference in language and text. Helen Sixou asserts that, I quote, "Woman must write herself, must write about women and bring women to writing from which they have been driven away as violently as their bodies," unquote, because of the repression of sexual pleasure and denial of expression. This kind of writing is the product of female physiology, which women must celebrate in their writing. Julia Kristeva distinguishes between the symbolic and the semiotic aspects of language. The symbolic aspect is associated with authority, order and control, and the semiotic aspect of discourse makes available a range of possibilities. The relationship between feminism and psychology was first expressed by Kate Millett in Sexual Politics, published in 1969, in which she argued against Freud for his patriarchal attitudes towards women. Sandra Gilbert and Susan Guba mention the notion of social castration, which means women's lack of social power. With this, we have a recap of what we have done so far. Feminism may be defined as a movement seeking equality while rejecting the diverse forms of discrimination perpetrated against a particular group of individuals solely on the basis of sex. Male-oriented ideologies and gender-based differences and oppressions are rejected. An individual who supports this ideology can be labeled a feminist regardless of gender. Organized movements, writing and theorizing have been the instruments used to spread the need for self-expression and building a body of feminist knowledge. The faces of women's movements, the diversity of approaches to feminism and feminist theorizing since the 1980s have ushered a fresh look into the objectives of feminist critical theory and practice. Despite the differences in approach, there exist several commonalities among the diverse forms of feminism. Feminist struggles are influenced by local, cultural, national and global factors that shape policies and economies. Interpolated by race, class, sex and religion, the differences within feminism have been directed to address the inherent plurality of issues. All this said, we have questions for you to answer that would enable you to understand feminism, its origin, the different aspects related to feminism and the plurality of concepts that have been addressed by feminism. Until we meet in the next session, where we would discuss the contribution of Maggie Humm. Thank you.